for the first time in American history, the final arbiters of all truths, science, is now questioning science. We've never had this before. Scientist and medical doctor challenging science and medical doctor. Tens of thousands of mainstream, pro-vaccine, board-certified physicians and scientists from respected institutions are challenging other scientists within the mainstream medical community, those affiliated with the pharmaceutical companies, those affiliated with medical magazines, those affiliated with the governmental agencies. They're calling them out, saying, you have given misinformation. A group of professors from Harvard, Stanford, and Oxford wrote what was called the Great Barrington Declaration. It has now been signed by nearly 70,000 physicians and scientists worldwide, and they are speaking out.
This is the largest experiment performed on human beings in the history of the world. It's being enabled by a regulatory structure that is not designed to protect us. It's designed to protect the pharmaceutical industry. And they generate all this revenue, and they use that revenue, it's weaponized, to control our legislature and to control our regulatory bodies.
So who do we believe? What is true? And what happens when one group has total power over what is supposedly real and true and necessary and official? Scientists against scientists, physician against physician, activists against activists, media against media, politician against politician. Historically, scientists were respected. It was almost sacrosanct that a scientist would never do anything that would put the public's health in jeopardy. Today, however, because of what has been revealed about COVID and the so-called sciences of COVID and the protocols, we are now questioning virtually everything, because so much of what we now call medical science is actually proprietary science. It is political science, but it is not based upon good public health science. Who's responsible? How do we get here? What are the consequences? What is the evidence? And how can we change it? This is about science on trial. Science under the microscope. Has it been so compromised, so corrupted, that we can no longer trust it with our lives? This is Science for Hire.
To arrive at the truth, the U.S. government should admit that the Wuhan Virology Institute was experimenting to enhance the coronavirus's ability to infect humans.
With all due respect, you are entirely and completely incorrect.
Dr. Fauci, do you still support funding of the NIH funding of the lab in Wuhan?
The NIH has not ever and does not now fund gain-of-function research in the Wuhan Institute, not
You don't think inserting
in China.
a bat virus spike protein that he got from the Wuhan Institute into the SARS virus is gain of function?
The NIH and NIAID categorically has not funded gain-of-function research to be conducted in the Wuhan Institute of Virology.
You do support it in the U.S. We have 11 labs doing it, and you have allowed it here. We have a committee to do it, but the committee has granted every exemption. You're fooling with Mother Nature here. You're allowing super viruses to be created with a 15% mortality. It's very dangerous. I think it was a huge mistake to share this with China, and it's a huge mistake to allow this to continue in the United States. And we should be very careful to investigate where this virus came from. There was research done with Dr. Shi and Dr. Barrick. They have collaborated on gain-of-function research where they enhanced the SARS virus to infect human airway cells, and they did it by merging a new spike protein on it. That is gain-of-function. That was joint research between the Wuhan Institute and Dr. Barrick. You can't deny it.
It's very clear from the research grants that were paid for by the United States, from the published papers that Shizheng Li and the others have published, by the patents that have been published, that they specifically set out to increase and made possible the ability of these viruses to infect, particularly with the HKU4 and the HIV pseudovirus glycoprotein 120 inserts that Shizheng Li and the others were involved with, that they intentionally sought to make this more infectious and, in fact, accomplished it.
Newly released documents obtained by The Intercept show the National Institute of Health directed a grant of $3.1 million to the US health organisation EcoHealth Alliance. The material confirmed the grant supported the construction in Wuhan of novel chimeric SARS-related coronaviruses that combined a spike gene from one coronavirus with genetic information from another coronavirus, and confirmed the resulting viruses could infect human cells.
Science has in many ways helped ease the suffering of this pandemic, which was more than likely caused by science. Novel respiratory coronavirus overtaking Wuhan, China. What do? Oh, you know who we could ask? The Wuhan Novel Respiratory Coronavirus Lab. The disease is the same name as the lab.
The money is what starts the scientific paradigm. COVID-19 is, from my understanding, already a $3+ trillion industry. What I've heard is that HIV is a $2+ trillion industry. They're economic paradigms, they are banking systems, they are used to re-engineer and rebuild the economic system worldwide.
Tony Fauci has been particularly adept at turning his agency into a subsidiary for Big Pharma. Tony Fauci does not do public health. He does pharmaceutical development. Between 2009 and 2016, there were about 240 new drugs approved by FDA, all of which came out of Tony Fauci's shop. His agency is the single biggest incubator for new pharmaceutical products. The whole system is about selling pharmaceutical drugs and not taking care of public health. So the drugs, no matter how dangerous they are, no matter how ineffective, are on the track to get approved. He controls the entire approval process because his PIs control all of these empires at Stanford, at Harvard, at Baylor University, at NYU and Columbia. And all of the major hospital research centers in the country are run by people, the department heads, the deans, etc., who are taking money from Tony Fauci.
It's not just the regulatory agencies that have been captured, but science has been captured and the journals have been captured. You can't get published and you can't do your research unless you can get a grant. And who controls the purse strings? It's the giant foundations. NIH's budget that they give out grants is over $40 billion. It's the biggest source of funding in the world.
He not only can control the outcome of your study, if your institution does a study that he doesn't like, he has the capacity to ruin your institution, to destroy you, because he can say you're not getting any money from NIH anymore.
There's a revolving door between the regulatory agencies and industry. The head of the CDC goes and heads up Merck vaccines globally. The head of FDA is now on the board of Pfizer. R&D heads at Sanofi and other pharmaceutical industries come directly from NIH. These agencies are rife with conflicts of interest. There is no separation.
Dr. Fauci was a $191 billion economic black hole of a failed enterprise to attempt desperately over the course of his entire tenure at the National Institutes for Allergy and Infectious Disease to find a way to vaccinate the world against HIV. And he is a stooge for a much darker story of the hijacking of America and the world's definition of health.
FDA gets 45% of its budget from pharmaceutical companies. So it's not regulating those companies, it's partners, and it's completely obedient and subservient to those companies. The NIH owns thousands of pharmaceutical patents. NIH has laboratories which help develop these new drugs, and then they patent the drugs. The really important job that NIAID is supposed to be doing, which is to be trying to find the source Of all these chronic diseases that began exploding under Tony Fauci's watch, he's supposed to be in charge of preventing those diseases, and yet not one vaccine of the 72 doses that are now mandated for American children has ever been subject to pre-licensing clinical trials where that compare a placebo group to the health outcomes in a vaccinated group. And so Tony Fauci, for the past 2 decades, has dictated the public health science that occurs not only in this country, but all around the world. And that's why we don't see studies that say, how has, for example, pesticides like glyphosate, how have they impacted public health? You don't see that kind of study coming out of NIAID.
The active ingredient in Roundup is called glyphosate. Glyphosate was patented in 1964, not as an herbicide, but as a broad-spectrum chelator. It hugs a lot of different minerals that are needed and does not allow the plants to access them. It also destroys some beneficial microorganisms in the soil, which normally provide nutrients to the plant. It also promotes pathogenic organisms in the soil, which then overrun the plant. And so it creates weaker plants, stronger disease, and the disease does the killing. Now, what do the livestock in the United States eat? They eat largely Roundup-ready crops. Roundup-ready soy, corn, cottonseed, canola mash, sugar beet pulp, and alfalfa. So a huge percentage of their food intake is Roundup-ready crops. And what do we eat? We eat plants and we eat animals and take their milk. So it turns out it's a perfect storm now, not just for plant disease, but for animal and human disease. Monsanto is the company that told us that PCBs were safe. They were convicted of actually poisoning people in their town next to the PCB factory and fined $700 million. They told us that Agent Orange was safe. They told us that DDT was safe, and now they're in charge of telling us if their own genetically modified foods are safe. Because the FDA doesn't require a single safety study, they leave it to Monsanto.
Pay close attention to what you're about to see. These rats have been fed with transgenic corn during their entire life cycle. The tumors they suffer from are enormous. The study that revealed the effect of the GMOs on the health of these rats has just been completed. It lasted for 2 years.
94% of them take effect in the mammary glands, which would equate to breast cancer in a woman. We are faced with renal tumors for the males. Some males also suffer from mammary tumors.
One could have thought that the main cause of death was coming from the pesticide added to the corn. But what the study highlighted, and this for the first time ever, is the fact that the transgenesis itself could have killed the rats. What this means is that just by interfering with the genome of the plant in order to modify it, we are faced with repercussions that no one could have anticipated. This is enough to make us reconsider all the scientific precepts that led to the creation of GMOs.
We spent over a year trying to obtain transgenic corn because no GMO manufacturers were willing to provide them. This is because Monsanto requires contracts to be signed stipulating that the seeds must not be used for testing. We wanted our study to be independent.
The conversation in Europe, in Asia, and in countries in South America is much more sophisticated in terms of its understanding of science, the importance of independent peer-reviewed science that isn't contaminated or corrupted by corporate influence. Here in the United States, the bedrock of the free market system and democracy, we are having our rights corrupted by corporate influence.
About 100 years ago, things were really beginning to change in the United States. We were changing from an agrarian economy to an industrial economy. Titans of industry really wanted to be able to control the world financial system as a whole. When the Rockefellers took over the allopathic medicine, there were many types of medical education in the United States. There were homeopathic doctors and there were naturopathic doctors who were using natural medicines to heal, and they were having very good outcomes. Once the Rockefellers took over the system, they closed down those other schools and they only promoted the sale of their drugs, they promoted surgery, and they promoted radiation. The Rockefellers were also in charge of the oil industry and the chemical industry, and they also made an alliance with a huge German concern called IG Farben, which was a big chemical industry in Germany. The Food and Drug Administration was started in the 1930s, and it was sold to the people of the United States as an agency that was going to protect its food and drug supply. And of course, in the early part of the century, people wrote about some of the terrible things that were happening with the meatpacking industry and in the food industry in general.
Nostrums were considered secret formulas, and there usually were proprietary formulas. So they got all these addictive drugs in there, and they weren't even listing them on the label. So people were thinking heroin and cocaine, morphine and other types of opiates. And they weren't being told that they're even on the label. So they forced a labeling.
There was a lot of mischief going on in the food industry, and the FDA was set up to correct that problem. They evolved into regulating drugs, medical devices, and at this point they regulate just about anything that goes into the human body.
In the 1930s, 1938, the FDA became a monster. And from that point forward, it has grown by leaps and bounds until the 60s, when it acquired jurisdiction over both safety and efficacy of drugs.
Then in 1938, they passed a law under Franklin Roosevelt defining a new drug, safe and effective for prevention, treatment, mitigation of disease, whatever. The FDA basically appointed itself as the experts. Senator Estes Kefauver sponsored an amendment that was passed, expanding the authority of the FDA to go beyond the safety of new drugs to the effectiveness of new drugs. And that was signed into law on October 10, 1962 by John Kennedy.
At that point, the FDA was largely captive of industry. The FDA does no clinical testing of drugs itself. It relies entirely on submissions made to it by the drug companies. This would appear to the average person to be a gross conflict of interest, and in fact it is.
We need independent testing to take the clinical trials out of the hands of the pharmaceutical industry. This needs to be the responsibility of government and universities rather than the pharmaceutical industry testing their own products. It's the proverbial fox guarding the hen house. And what we have is a corruption of the system, and it's particularly alarming that the regulatory agencies and the government don't do anything about it.
The American Medical Association contributes, unfortunately, to the corruption in healthcare because they sell lists to the drug industry, which allows the drug industry to find out exactly which drugs a particular doctor uses. Then the drug industry can reward those doctors that use far too expensive drugs, and they can even check if that doctor holds his or her promise. So this is an invitation to corruption.
The oligarchy of corporations here has basically usurped cherished institutions of democracy, which involve checks and balances in the system, but also scientific integrity. So who's looking out for scientific integrity?
WHO should be there to represent the interests of people on this planet. That's what their charter is. But unfortunately, the WHO, the NIH, CDC are so influenced by Big Pharma. So I think, we need to evolve to a point where Big Pharma gets removed from the equation. Big Pharma is the biggest contributor to lobbyists. They control the media, they control the press. So they have a stranglehold on free speech, scientific investigation, scientific integrity. I think COVID has brought out the worst in this respect, and I think it's time that these organizations should go back to what their goal is, what their fundamental charter is to provide the best health to people on this planet, and that profiteering should not be driving this.
The Codex Alimentarius, the International Food Code, is basically the particular forum that the FDA gets its chance to have input into systems that govern the way in which food will be controlled and the trade in food will be managed and how the consumers of foods will be protected. What has interested me over the years in attending Codex meetings is the FDA is one of the major controllers of policy.
The average typical Codex delegate, that they seem to be the unwitting tools of those who have another agenda, which is to push GMO crops on us, to poison us with melamine, to poison our foods, our meats with ractopamine, let alone fluoride and all the other poisons in our environment. And they accumulate in the human body. And so who's protecting us from that? Codex is supposed to do that, but in effect what they're doing is giving a free pass to a lot of the industry to push these poisons through.
We argue that evidence-based medicine is an illusion. It is a great concept were it implemented in a way in which the scientific foundation of medicine could proceed with absolute trust and reliability. But that's simply not the case. Part of the corruption of medicine by the pharmaceutical industry is the co-opting of academics. What is really going on is that they're nothing but names that are lending their professorial status and the status of their university to branding the pharmaceutical products. That key opinion leader's university affiliation is worth an enormous amount of money in terms of confidence.
My academic friends report things are very different for them in universities. These days, the major funding bodies are still governments, but they tend to decide sort of directional themes, often agreed internationally. And basically, if your research falls into one of those themes, you might get funded, and if it doesn't, you literally will be starved out. Because the only other source of funding are large private institutions. So in Britain, for example, biggest one is the Medical Research Council, which is basically public money. And the next one is the Wellcome Trust, which is a very large endowment and is used to drive research that's of interest to its management. I won't get grants if I speak about this stuff. So I want you to know that the academics in your country are easily pushed around, frankly, by both politicians and people with lots of money.
The myth of scientific freedom, even in the US, is a myth. Even the major medical journals like the New England Journal of Medicine and Lancet are controlled by Big Pharma.
Professor John Ioannidis, I think he's the most published epidemiologist and scientist alive, and he says Marcia Angel and Richard Horton. Angel used to be the editor of the New England Journal of Medicine and Horton at the Lancet, and they all say that research that's produced and peer-reviewed and published in the journals can't be trusted, that it's probably fake.
So I don't think there is such a thing as academic freedom and scientific freedom. And so the NIH gets into contractual relationships with companies that once they patent a drug, the NIH gets a certain amount of the revenue. So they make a lot of money from these patented drugs under development, including the vaccines.
What has happened in something like the past 20 or 30 years, especially with blockbuster drugs, is that we're sold a lot of pharmaceuticals where the risk-benefit ratio is not in favor of taking the drug, and we have all sorts of instances where people who really didn't need to be on these drugs took these drugs and then had serious adverse events.
Well, experts say addiction can happen in just 5 days, and of course it can kill you.
25% of people between the ages of 18 and 34 know someone who is or who has been addicted to pain medication.
The current opiate crisis is officially the deadliest drug crisis in American history. The CDC reports since 1999, more than 500,000 people in the United States have died from drug overdoses involving opiates, and millions more suffer from opiate use disorder.
There was nobody to tell me that these have a really high potential for addiction. How could I be addicted? I get these from my doctor.
My son Steve did not want to die, but his prescription opioids killed him.
During 2020, overdose deaths exploded to more than 90,000. 28 states saw drug overdose deaths increase by more than 30%.
Once you've found the right doctor and have told him or her about your pain, don't be afraid to take what they give you. Often, it will be an opioid medication.
Purdue Pharma, manufacturer of OxyContin, reached a settlement with 23 states and 2,000 local governments. Purdue Pharma filed for bankruptcy and will pay as much as $12 billion over time. The Sacklers, owners of Purdue Pharma, who admit no wrongdoing and who by their own reckoning earn more than $10 billion from the opiate sales, remain one of the wealthiest families in the world. Pharma executives seldom face prison even when their fraudulent drug causes many deaths.
Vioxx has killed at least 60,000 Americans. It caused about 130,000 excess cases of heart attack and strokes. It's one of the most lethal drugs ever approved because it was used by so many people. The total sales of Vioxx over its period of time it was allowed on the market was over $11 billion. And they had to pay the federal government a $950 million fine. They've paid out about $4 billion in settlements to the victims of Vioxx. But the company is way ahead of the game in their fraudulent marketing of Vioxx.
There are many other drugs that can fall into the category of unsafe drugs that have been approved. Bextra, for example, had heart toxicity risks and ultimately was removed from the market because of those risks, but for many, many years, the FDA kept it on the market. Statin drugs have been approved despite the fact that at the time the FDA convened its medical panel, review panel on the statin drugs, the panel at first refused to approve the drug, while the unfortunate reality of the drugs is that they block production of an essential energy enzyme, coenzyme Q10, which can lead to heart failure. So here we have again a situation where a drug has been approved to lower your risk of heart abnormalities that in the end can contribute to heart fatalities.
Katic. It is a drug used as an antibiotic. There's plenty of other antibiotics out there, but Katic, that one caused severe liver damage. FDA had a hint that there was liver damage before the approval, but they approved it anyway. What's really frightening is the clinical study that was done to validate the safety of Katic never occurred. It was done at a clinical research facility that was closed at the time that the alleged study was conducted. But Katic did get approved, and as a result, it killed a lot of people, destroyed their livers, necessitated liver transplants, thereby ruining people's lives. It was something that never should have been allowed on the market, eventually was withdrawn, but it never should have been approved in the first place.
There's one drug, Tracelol. Tracelol was used during heart surgery to prevent some bleeding, to control bleeding. And when they finally found that Tracelol killed about 1,000 people per month, the drug company actually went to a very famous Harvard professor and tried to drown him in money to schmooze things over. Well, the man was so disgusted with that approach, he went public, and Tracelol was taken off the market all over the world. But guess what? Only in the US, the FDA issued a warning. Well, how could we interfere with drug company profits?
Avandia increases the risk of heart attack. And as a general heart toxin, it has been condemned in the peer-reviewed scientific literature. Despite that fact, FDA's own scientific review panel held it to be a heart toxin. Commissioner Hamburg decided that she would keep it on the market, available to those who are currently using it for precisely those people who are at the greatest risk of a heart attack or other heart abnormality arising from the drug.
Accutane. That was an acne drug that was supposed to be given only in the most severe cases of acne because it was known it had side effects. It caused severe birth defects. They denied that it caused people to commit suicide, but it did. But they were able to keep the warning off of that for many, many years. One congressman Bart Stupik from Michigan. His son committed suicide at 17. Now these are kids, they weren't diagnosed with depression, they weren't diagnosed with any mental disorder, and they take this acne drug and they commit suicide.
This company positively, absolutely knew that they had a medication that was infected with the AIDS virus. They took the product off the market in the U.S. and then they dumped it in France, Europe, Asia, and Latin America. So they made a huge profit. By the way, Joe, government officials in France that allowed that to happen actually had to go to prison for it. In America, not one corporate executive for this company has been indicted or even criminally investigated.
And if you've ever wondered why a terminally ill cancer patient is given lots of chemotherapy almost up until the point that they're dying or dead, it's because the economic incentive is there to continue putting chemotherapy into cancer patients who have no chance whatsoever of benefiting from it. In each and every case when we tried to recruit a mainstream oncologist, the question they asked us is, what is your chemotherapy bonus structure? I was unaware of this back in the year 2000. I asked them, well, what do you mean by that? They said, well, our pay is based on how much chemotherapy we prescribe. That's where our profit center is. And if we don't have a strong chemotherapy reimbursement incentive, we'll find a cancer center that will give us a strong chemotherapy bonus.
Rather than have confidence that a drug approved by the FDA is safe and effective, we now have to wait for millions of people to take it and to see what kind of reactions they have in the real world.
Where there's criminal activity by executives of drug companies, they frequently get away with paying a fine and have no major disruption of their enterprise.
They're spending $6 million a day on lobbyists in Washington, D.C. alone.
Political decisions, lobbying of the government by the largest lobby in the United States, which is the pharmaceutical industry. We really see this as a political problem. It's a systematic failure of government to address the corruption of medicine. It's a systematic failure of government to ensure the reliability of science and the integrity of science.
They're supposed to be the safeguard against drug company avarice and greed.
We've gone from the idea that the regulator provides oversight of the industry to the idea that the regulator treats the industry as a client, and the client is paying a user fee to have their drugs or their vaccines approved. And they can even pay to have for a rapid approval.
Modern American medicine kills between 400 and 700,000 deaths every year. Based on more conservative figures, conventional medicine has killed 8 million of its own citizens during the past 20 years. Annual medical-related injuries number in the millions.
I have estimated that our prescription drugs are the third major cause of death after heart disease and cancer. It kills so many people that it amounts to 200,000 patients every year in the United States alone. Half of these patients use the drugs correctly, so they die from the side effects. The other half of the patients, for those some kind of error was involved. Maybe the doctor prescribed a drug together with another drug that they should not have done because this other drug could increase the risk of dying. And there are so many precautions and contraindications and warnings for drugs that a single drug might come with 20, 30 or 40 warnings. The drug industry is interested in drugging us as much as possible and for as long as possible. And one of the best examples of this is psychiatry. That whenever something untoward happens to a patient, the drug industry says, it is not our drug's fault, it is your disease. It's your fault. So some people are kept on antidepressants indefinitely. They can't get off them. because they get abstinence symptoms that can be quite terrible. And what does the drug industry say? They rejoice. Wonderful. We keep the patients on antidepressants indefinitely. And we keep on telling people that you cannot get dependent on antidepressant drugs. That's not really the case. And this is, of course, a lie.
My wife has had TMJ. Her front teeth did not actually come together. She had a lot of pain. We went to her primary doctor. He started giving her Vicodin for pain control. Basically, she got put on benzodiazepines and Neurontin, Vicodin ES, eventually on Abilify, Remeron, venlafaxine, Vistral, just a real cocktail of drugs. And of course, our experience is that in the process of finally discovering that the drugs could be the problem, we tried to start a taper program at home because I couldn't get the doctors to do it for me. We learned what it was like to try to relate to the medical community. They keep wanting to tell you that you have an underlying problem. They never want to look at the drugs as a possible cause of it.
And as for me, this is the year of the myofascial pain lockup. Yes, I'm seeing my physical therapist 3 times a week. We've made some progress, but we're still working on trying to relax muscles.
Oh, it seems like all day and all night.
Are you light sensitive? You keep squinting. Is it like you can't take the light?
Yeah, it's just... when somebody touches me, the burning is sensitive, and light is sensitive, sounds are sensitive.
Do you know what day it is?
I think it's Tuesday.
Bingo.
Oh, good, I got it right. I have such pain, but right here, my shoulder, and neck, jaw.
My wife was prescribed Klonopin and Ativan for chronic pain and muscle spasms. It's been about 8 months, and we are experiencing a living hell. Doctors are not willing to help. The more I get on the internet, the more I read, the more nauseated I become. And we have tried to taper the Ativan about 1/4 of the dose. I'm going to document this event. I'm going to film her, and I'm going to show you what this is like to go through. If for some reason we as a family don't make it through, you'll know why.
Our culture, our society, the nations of the Western world have been taken over by what I call the psychopharmaceutical complex. It starts with the multi-billion-dollar industries that make psychiatric drugs. They have transformed the medical societies, the psychiatric societies. They've transformed the medical schools, the hospital system, the insurance system. They have transformed how people are treated in the VA, how people are treated in the Army, and everywhere they have pushed drugs and pushed more and more drugs. Their agenda is not complicated, it's marketing. They want to market to more and more and more people, and they don't care what a brain-damaged, docile society they create along the way.
The belief in the United States in unrestrained capitalism and market forces that will solve all problems, which is definitely wrong. Market forces in healthcare will create problems because they lead to overdiagnosis, that you give a diagnosis to far too many people that you should have left alone, and overtreatment with drugs. And drugs have side effects, drugs can be lethal, and capitalism is a very bad motivator for achieving good results in healthcare. It is counterproductive.
You can't take back your diagnosis in psychiatry, nor can you take back the electroconvulsive therapy, nor the lobotomy, the chemical lobotomy with Prozac, Thorazine. What do we know? We know that all mass killings in the last 25 years have been 95% of people are on psychiatric meds. Instead of exploring the meds first, we immediately attribute the violence from the guns. So, the people enter medicine for noble reasons. My concern is the patients go to doctors because they know that they want to help them, get well. My concern is that the doctor's not helping the patient and the patient's not helping themselves with the current model.
When I was in my training, giving a drug to a child, a psychiatric drug, was quite rare. Now, when I was a child in the 40s and the 50s, it was simply unheard of. I had a lot of friends. I never had a friend who took a psychiatric drug. Back in the 40s, they discovered these drugs were incredibly addictive. By the 1970s, the drug enforcement agencies throughout the world considered methylphenidate, which is Ritalin, and the amphetamines like Dexedrine and Adderall, that these were a major offender in all of our communities, and there were rashes of addiction for these drugs around the world. So it became well known, and they weren't marketed much. And the drug companies are looking for markets for children. They're thinking about, who can we get our drugs to? And they realize that the amphetamines, as we knew in the 40s, crush spontaneous behavior. And so they made up a diagnosis called ADD, attention deficit disorder, and they had a list they could give teachers now. And by gosh, why it was just like every child that was difficult in class. And that if you gave them a drug after the first dose, they were quieter. They're quieter for a few weeks before the brain fights back, because the brain doesn't like any drugs, especially doesn't like any of the psychiatric drugs, and it fights back. And so we have the beginning of this horrendous assault on our children, carefully calculated, carefully figured out.
Most of these really terrible drugs are prescribed chronically. They're tested 6 weeks, but they're taken year after year, and that's buildup. When a drug has toxicity, it builds up. Diabetes doesn't happen overnight, although it is frightening the fast speed at which children become diabetic from antipsychotics.
Psychotic symptoms in a clinic showed that over a period of years in the clinic, 10% of the kids would have periods of psychotic symptoms due to the drug. OCD, the only good study done was done at NIMH. 50% of the children on these drugs develop OCD. Prozac was introduced as having few side effects, when in fact it had so many drastic side effects that the company's original investigator said the drug was too toxic to be used as a first-line antidepressant. Well, they just changed the PR campaign and made it the first-line antidepressant.
The doctor told us that he thought the drug Prozac would help Jacob, that it's a common prescribed drug used in teenagers now, that he thought it would help him with his moods and just make him feel happier. So he was put on Prozac that afternoon, 10 milligrams. The morning of my son's death, we had talked that morning. He did not want to go to school that day. And he just said that he would go the next day. They were getting out for Christmas holidays. I left for work, and a few hours later I began to call home because with him being at home by himself, I was concerned. So I did not get an answer, and I continued to call for a couple of hours. Then I left, and it took me 30 minutes to get home, and I found my son hanging in our attic. My husband and I attended a FDA hearing in Washington about the side effects that can happen with these drugs. And unfortunately, the first hearing there was 65 parents there. Their children had died while on antidepressants. Some of them were on the drug a matter of days before they committed suicide.
So essentially what psychiatry managed to do was to draw like a canopy over the Western world and turn it into a mental hospital.
In Denmark, for example, we take so many drugs that each Dane can be in treatment with 1.5 drugs for their entire life, from cradle to grave. and 1 out of 8 citizens take at least 5 drugs every day. So we actually have no idea what happens when we take 5 drugs at the same time. The only thing we know is that the more drugs you take at the same time, the greater the risk that something goes badly wrong.
I don't think there's any doubt any longer that psychiatric drugs are doing far more harm than good. We're damaging the brains of millions of human beings permanently. Psychiatry is not a science. It is absolutely, because it's so fundamentally wrong in thinking harming the brain is going to be good for the mind or the spirit. It just won't work.
I have studied psychiatry for 8 years now, and I have never seen anything as bad in the rest of healthcare. Most of the research is so flawed that I call it pseudoscience, that it is made to confirm some beliefs that are simply not true.
Now what I'm saying is that psychiatry is fundamentally transhumanism, which is that you do not in any way respect or treasure the existence of a child or a human being, a grown adult, as having inherent merit or worth. Instead, you can get enough power, you can go ahead and pick any number of humanity, whether by a vaccine or lobotomizing of little children, and you can transform them into something else.
The United States provided a serious blow to the mafia when they introduced a law, perhaps in the 1980s, where those at the top responsible for the crimes those lower down committed. This wasn't possible before the law was changed. And why not do the same for the drug industry? Everybody that contributes to wrongdoing in healthcare that harms patients should be prosecuted, no matter where they are. They should go to jail, because this might cause some of them to think twice before they commit the worst crimes.
So in the case of Dr. Gutcha, what happened was he criticized a meta-analysis that was done by the Cochrane on the vaccine Gardasil, and that led to his eventually being expelled from the Cochrane and also losing his position as a professor at the university in Copenhagen. He is not compromising a bit on this whole issue of the corruption of medicine. I think that he takes his moral responsibility as a doctor to be supreme, and he's not going to compromise that the least bit. He's seen up close what exactly the pharmaceutical industry is doing in corrupting medicine and how that is now spreading to the very sorts of institutions that are supposed to guarantee the reliability of evidence-based medicine, namely the Cochrane.
A life and death debate. Should young girls be required to get a new vaccine to prevent cervical cancer? The maker of the vaccine is backing down, but at least one U.S. governor is not.
Governor Rick Perry, a Republican, who made Texas the first state to mandate that 6th grade girls receive the HPV vaccine.
In the midst of this executive order, there was a big drug company that made millions of dollars because of this mandate. The governor's former chief of staff was the chief lobbyist for this drug company. The drug company gave thousands of dollars in political donations to the governor, and this is just flat out wrong. The question is it about life, or was it about millions of dollars and potentially billions for a drug company?
All right.
This is not a vaccine against a pandemic. It's not a vaccine against a childhood illness that will kill you. It is a vaccine against a virus that 90% of the time does absolutely nothing to anybody.
antigenicity studies show that the antibodies last less than 5 years on average. While it covers a few strains, there's only one strain present at the 5-year mark. We don't know how long that lasts. The other 2 or 3 strains are gone by 2 or 3 years in girls and less than that in boys. So if the recommendation is boosters throughout the life, but if you've already been exposed and you receive the vaccine, it could potentiate the virus, then we're dealing with a vaccine that's probably going to be causing a whole lot more cervical cancers than it ever saves.
There is a cognitive disconnect when it comes to vaccines. On the one hand, we're told that they're safe and effective. The U.S. Public Health Service, the CDC, the FDA, all state unequivocally that you may occasionally find a bad hot lot, but otherwise they're perfectly safe.
I'm seeing tapes, audio files released on YouTube. It is a senior scientist at the CDC talking with Brian Hooker about how it was the darkest day of his life and they were instructed to shred data.
I have great shame now when I meet families with kids with autism because I have been part of the problem. I shoulder that the CDC has put the research 10 years behind, all right? Because the CDC has not been transparent, we've missed 10 years of research because the CDC is so paralyzed right now by anything related to autism.
Right.
They're not doing what they should be doing.
When Dr. Thompson originally got a hold of me in 2013, he was one of the senior epidemiologists in the National Center for Birth Defects and Developmental Disabilities. And he was very much ready and open to tell me exactly what happened in the CDC regarding these multiple instances of fraud.
There's too much corruption, too much conflict of interest, and our children are paying the price.
Well, it is an incredibly controversial subject to say the least. But those protesters outside the CDC here in Atlanta say that the information being provided to the public about vaccines is not completely honest. And all of it hinges on one man. This guy right here, a scientist you've probably never heard of. That scientist's name is Dr. William Thompson. And it was on August 27th of 2014 that Dr. Thompson made an admission that got very little media coverage, but it was a major statement. That statement read in part, quote, "I regret that my co-authors and I omitted statistically significant information in our 2004 article published in the journal Pediatrics. The omitted data suggested that African American males who received the MMR vaccine before age 36 months were at increased risk for autism."
They found a link both between black males given the vaccine under the age of 3 and a tripling of the autism rate, and in what they called isolated autism, which meant just previously healthy children with no risk factors who suddenly regress into autism after the MMR.
I started looking into it, and somebody provided me with the Simpsonwood memo. Simpsonwood was the transcripts of a secret meeting that was held between CDC and representatives of the vaccine industry, in which they reviewed a report that CDC had ordered, the Verstraeten study, of the 100,000 children in the United States Vaccine Safety Database, which they are talking about the undeniability of the connection between autism and thimerosal, the impossibility of massaging the data further in order to try to eliminate those signals. That's what they spend the first 2 hours. The rest of the meeting they spend talking about how do we hide this from the press, from the public, and saying there's a clear link, not just with autism, but with a whole range of neurological disorders. Speech delay, language delay, all kinds of learning disorders, ADD, hyperactivity disorder, and the injection of these vaccines. And they could tell because, as you know, the vaccine protocols were dramatically increased. When I was a little boy, we only got 3 vaccines. But my children, 5 of my 6 children, got 22 vaccines. Beginning in 1989, that's the thimerosal generation. That's the vaccine generation, and it's the sickest generation in the history of this country.
What the 1986 National Childhood Vaccine Injury Act has done is it has turned the Department of Justice into the lawyer for the vaccine industry, not for the American people. So the DOJ has no interest in investigating these scandals because they work for the industry. They defend HHS against Americans who have been harmed. They are CDC's lawyer against vaccine injury victims.
In 1986, Congress, having accepted millions of dollars of vaccine industry money, of pharma industry money, passed a law that made it illegal for any American to sue a vaccine company, no matter how dangerous the vaccine, no matter how sick the person got, no matter how reckless or negligent the company was, you can't sue them. And that emboldened the industry, and it emboldened the regulatory agency. It suddenly made vaccines immensely profitable.
This is truly an unprecedented situation.
This virus doesn't discriminate. It attacks everyone.
The sounds of sirens are gone.
Many of the same people inside and outside government who mismanaged the AIDS epidemic are now repeating their mistakes during this crisis. The irony is that they are using the same strategies almost 30 years later, control the narrative through the supplicant and obedient media, censor criticism of alternative opinions, and destroy the reputations of those who hold a different scientific view.
I always thought that the newsroom was working to convey the truth in the past, and never did I ever think that we were doing anything but trying to tell the truth. If the whole narrative is get your vaccine and everybody get vaccinated and that's how we're going to get back to normal, and that's what you're seeing on your news wires or what have you, and then we're all reporting that, then why would you question it? You wouldn't question anything.
This trusted news initiative that came together last year, the big CBC, ABC, NBC, Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, Reuters, BBC, they said, we will only promote the vaccine and we will censor anyone that speaks anything that promotes a vaccine hesitancy, and we will suppress anything that speaks about drugs that we don't hear from the CDC or the WHO. So if that doesn't tell you that there is a whole lot of censorship and suppression going on, nothing tells you. Everything should be wide open, and these newspapers should be printing reports from all points of view.
Medical doctors are being silenced. Why are they losing their licenses? These are people who are trained professionals. They went through med school. They've been practicing for decades. They're using their medical judgment. It's unprecedented. And the scientists who are trying to publish papers and not able to do so are censored. It's just absolutely abhorrent.
You can be got at, let's put it that way. It started off with me with death threats after I made a presentation to the Edmonton City Council. Internet warriors. Are they real? Are they just psycho? It's a crapshoot. You take precautions. You may not just lose your ability to build a system and earn a living. You may have your faculty position taken away from you. You may have your hospital privileges taken away from you. And those are all a bit different, because at least there's some kind of process at the colleges, although it is the star chamber in essence. You know, you're expected to say, yes, the earth is flat, can I go now? That's the essence of, otherwise we'll bankrupt you. Have I got your attention yet?
This is a thing you're going to just say someone's crazy when they say something that's inconvenient or say something that makes you uncomfortable because you've decided to accept a certain narrative. Did Twitter warn you?
No. Yeah, I was deplatformed from LinkedIn many months ago. And it was... there was actually 2 events of deplatforming in LinkedIn. And in both cases, I was able to get an explanation for what the specific crimes were, the thought crimes. in the first one, it was a LinkedIn posting in which I pointed out that the chairman of the board of Thomson Reuters also sits on the board of Pfizer. And I simply wrote, does this look like a conflict of interest to you? Okay. And this gets to your core question about tech. It's not tech. It's the horizontal integration across all major industries now under the control of common funds. All of these industries, the harmonization of the tech censorship, the interests of pharma, big media, etc., and governments, all being harmonized in their messaging globally. I mean, I travel a lot. Okay, I see the same, and I have physicians coming to me all the time about what they're experiencing. The same playbook is going on every continent.
As a physicist, nuclear cardiologist, and attorney with 54 years of research, I've been stunned at what's happened in the last couple years as I've watched a medical McCarthyism sweep the land. Efforts by doctors like myself, Dr. McCullough, Dr. Simone Gold, and hundreds and thousands of other doctors attempting to get correct information out to their patients have been maligned by mainstream media, big pharma, and the government in an effort to silence the information we're attempting to bring to you.
It's not okay what's going on. The censorship isn't okay. The gaslighting of people who have symptoms, the censorship on social media, these things, just to give one example, there was a Facebook group of kind of a contact group of people that were sharing stories about adverse events associated with vaccination. And it just got deleted.
There were something like 2,000 people on your various Facebook groups, support groups, people like your friend there that were using that group to comfort each other, provide counseling to, in your case, you're providing counseling to people who are suicidal. Describe what Facebook did to your support groups.
They found us and quickly pulled us apart. They eliminated every single person in those groups, and we lost contact with a lot of people that were in crisis.
So you mentioned in your testimony that NIH knows about this, CDC knows about this, FDA knows about this. I appreciate what media came here, but not only did we invite these agency heads, we invited mainstream media, or more mainstream media, and of course they didn't show up. In our Milwaukee event in June, we actually had probably a couple dozen cameras. We had media show up. But unfortunately not to tell these stories. They showed up basically so they could then attack me as an anti-vaxxer with the headline, "So Fundamentally Dangerous." That's what we're up against.
Everybody who speaks the truth is ruthlessly persecuted, pariahed, career annihilated, and there is a force that comes down and just cuts like a big scissors, just cuts your opportunities. You used to speak, you used to do this, you can forget about it. Robert F. Kennedy Jr. used to speak and be paid millions of dollars to speak at universities all over the country about the environment and about his environmental causes. And as soon as he went up against the vaccine cabal, all of that stopped overnight.
So the media has absolutely fueled this misinformation. All the misinformation about ivermectin, about what the doctors are saying, about the dangers of the vaccine, because the man behind the news desk isn't telling the public is confused, and the public doesn't believe. And all the voices that are rising up, no matter how strong your voice is, no matter if you're Luc Montagnier or if you're Robert Malone or Peter McCullough, you are not getting the coverage you deserve, and your voice isn't being heard the way it should be heard. And that is the misinformation.
On the 23rd of June, I was called into this WebEx meeting, and I was fired of all these positions. I was stripped of my university faculty position, and fired from my roles as director of QI, Quality Improvement and Patient Safety, and fired from my role as the director of Surgical Humanities Program. Now, my offense or crime was supposedly asking for informed consent from parents and children in the rollout of the Pfizer COVID-19 vaccine to our children in Saskatchewan. To tell the patient or the person what are the risks of the intervention, what are the benefits, and are there any alternatives? I pointed out the fact that the WARES system, the adverse events reporting system, there were at that time more than 6,000 deaths. I pointed out this is an association and not a causation, but it's a strong signal and it cannot be ignored. I said that this particular vaccine for kids is already showing harm. It's showing a condition called myocarditis. And Swedish vaccine agency, German vaccine agency, had made very clear recommendations that only very otherwise sick, somebody with leukemia or a kid with immunocompromised should be vaccinated with this vaccine, and otherwise it should be not given to kids. This is not an emergency. The risk of dying of COVID is less than the risk of dying of the annual flu. It's 0.003%.
We as physicians in certain institutions are being forced essentially to be vaccinated. Otherwise, we will lose our privileges. We won't be able to operate. First, do no harm, informed consent. Am I going to stand up and be counted like we've done, the four merry men here? Or are we just going to go with the flow? And sadly, most of my colleagues are going with the flow. They're simply shutting up. They've been silenced.
Do you remember the time when we all felt sorry for the Chinese? Because their government was controlling their access to information. Their government was controlling their internet. Their government was controlling what they can do, where they can move, their government was forcing them to have internal passports. Remember when we all felt sorry for the Chinese? Wake up, because here we are.
It would seem that Fauci, the CDC, the World Health Organization, and the mainstream media are using the identical playbook in their management of COVID-19, as was done during the AIDS crisis. Tony Fauci, he destroyed every competing theory about the cause of AIDS. He defunded every single scientist who dared say anything in a research proposal about looking at alternative causes of AIDS. He crushed that dissent. He was very good at it. He was methodical. He was ruthless.
One such treatment that was ignored was Bactrim. PCP was the leading killer in AIDS patients, and many doctors were prescribing the inexpensive antibiotic as a prophylaxis to prevent AIDS victims from developing the rare pneumonia. There was evidence that the antibiotic should be used as a prophylaxis. Despite the science, Dr. Fauci declined to conduct a clinical trial. Doctors and advocates continued to push for its use, and finally, a couple years later, it was adopted, after thousands of patients had already died. On the treatment front, Fauci and the team of scientists at the NIH began frantically working on a vaccine, believing that would be the way to end the AIDS epidemic. The public was losing patience. Pharmaceutical companies were also racing towards a treatment for AIDS, realizing the incredible potential for profits. In 1987, one such company was Burroughs Wellcome, a British drug company who showed in a test tube that their failed cancer drug, AZT, could be repurposed to treat AIDS. Limited studies were done, long-term side effects were unknown, but in record speed, in less than 4 months, the FDA approved the drug as a treatment, claiming the benefits outweigh the risks.
Tragically, the first dose, which was chosen at random, was so high it could kill a horse. It was 1,800 milligrams of this incredibly toxic chemical. And that early dose just killed people like flies. They were dropping like flies.
Of the studies used to claim benefits for AZT, all of them without exception were financed by Burroughs Wellcome, the manufacturer of AZT, and were controlled by them.
The expensive drug made Burroughs Wellcome record profits, and at the time it was the most expensive drug ever marketed. But people were desperate. They would do anything to get their lives back. despite numerous doctors raising concerns about the toxicity of the drug, some even saying that it was doing the very opposite of what it claimed to do, that is, it was actually shortening the lives of their patients. Fauci and other health officials disagreed. In 1989, Fauci began to promote the drug, not only for critically ill AIDS patients, but for anyone who tested positive for HIV, including those asymptomatic who showed no signs of disease. Those patients included hospital workers, pregnant women, and even children.
The orthodox side has admitted in subsequent years that AZT killed a lot of people. The estimate I've heard is upward of 300,000, mostly gay men, killed by AZT alone. They called it monotherapy.
As I understand it, Burroughs Wellcome saw very early on that they could make a move into a new market. You can hardly blame them. That's what capitalism is. It's an ever-expanding market, isn't it? Of course, in this country, along with Professor Robin Weiss, they developed one of the first antibody tests, which gave them an open door to sell the drugs to the people who tested positive on their test.
With discovery of both the virus and this new process, we now have a blood test for AIDS. With the blood test, we can identify AIDS victims with essentially 100% certainty.
The way they terrorize people is to conflate in people's minds testing positive on a PCR test, and these people are being told they can expect to get sick and quite possibly die. Americans have to understand the test means nothing. The test means nothing. We've got to hold these people criminally accountable for what they have done to the world in the name of a diagnostic test. The inventor of the test, I've written about this extensively, was very clear. This test was not designed to tell you whether you're going to get sick, to tell you whether you have a virus. That is not what PCR is.
The general public doesn't understand the idea of a gold standard here. Neither do doctors, physicians. If they didn't allow them to charge so much for it, I think there'll be a lot less use of it. You know, it's just like in political scandals. Follow the money trail. Figure out who's getting paid for this. They didn't give it to us, they sold it to us.
Yeah, who sold it to us? Who gets money off the patent?
Gallo himself was getting quite a bit off of it. He had to give a lot back to Montagnier when it was finally proven that he stole the virus from Montagnier in the first place. But Montagnier and the Pasteur Institute are getting $1, I think, or so every time that somebody gets an HIV test. If you get it twice in a row, you have a pretty good chance of getting a plus one time and a minus the next. It was very interesting that they predicted approximately 1 million North Americans were infected in 1984, I think it was, and it stayed the same right on through 1996. That's not an epidemic. The number of cases reported went up epidemically, you know, exponentially, because the number of tests that was done went up exponentially. The antibody test was something they could quickly develop. That's what Gallo did and sell, and so he did. And he said, we're going to make a lot of money off this. Everybody in the world is going to have to take this test to find out who's going to die of the plague. And a lot of people did take it, and he got a lot of money for it. I mean, and there's all kind of people all the way down the line getting paid for doing something that's absolutely insane.
All it can do is, at certain thermal cycles, and this is where it gets so sinister. Every American needs to hear this. The setting for the PCR COVID tests are generally between 35 and up to 45, averaging about 40. Well, lo and behold, Anthony Fauci himself was caught. I don't think he meant to say this, but he let it slip and we caught it. He says in this interview, anything above 35 is nothing. It's not an infection. It's just dead nucleotides.
We have seen a lot of false positives with the coronavirus testing. Many of these false positives are believed to be triggered by dead virus cells. We have seen examples of goats and fruit testing positive, which raises more questions than it answers.
The thing that seems to be at the center of this is the PCR test. The PCR test is the one thing that does seem to be simulating a pandemic, and the way it was set up by Professor Drosten, which seems to be the blueprint for the rest of the world because it was recommended by the WHO, the way he set his test up at way over 35 cycles of amplification, it was bound to produce mostly false positives.
I do think the PCR test has been central
to the deception. That is, it's being used to create in the minds of the citizens all around the world the idea that there is this severe acute respiratory syndrome virus. When you're doing 10,000 or 100,000 tests a day, as in UK, contamination is a major problem in PCR. It's an amplification technique, and at high numbers of cycles, Rainer, as you said, theoretically, you might amplify what was in the sample by 1 trillion fold. So it's pure and simple fraud, in my country at least, absolute fraud.
I've done PCR for decades and decades. I did my undergrad honors thesis using PCR. We've created a case-demic in the world by saying, oh, you have a positive PCR, you're a case. Never in the history of medicine have we done this. If somebody has a symptom and a confirmatory test, then that's helpful in saying, okay, you are a case of that disease. But if you don't have symptoms from that organism you're carrying, it's because your competent immune system is keeping it at bay. You're not a case of that disease just because I can detect it. So we've lost some sanity in what we're doing in modern medicine, kind of collectively lost our medical minds, and we're saying, oh, it's present, you're sick. I'm like, no, it's present, it's present. And many people asymptomatic, never got a symptom. That's because their immune system was competent and just quietly keeping it in the background. You're not a case of a disease if you're not manifesting symptoms of an illness.
Even the WHO has conceded that the virus, regardless of whether it is fully or semi-artificial or natural, is no more dangerous than the common flu, with an infection fatality rate of 0.14%. And the Drosten PCR test, which was declared by the WHO under control of Bill Gates and the Chinese as the gold standard for detecting infections, is an outrageous fraud.
I've witnessed a lot of what I guess the media has been talking about, and I see how they've misrepresented the truth on COVID, the truth on the testing. For instance, at my facility, I work at the biggest skilled nursing facility here in Oahu, and I work with the geriatric population. The people that were moved to the COVID unit didn't have COVID. They tested positive with the PCR test, but most of them were asymptomatic and only suffering from their pre-existing conditions. None of them had exacerbated symptoms. Most of them weren't sick other than what they were already dealing with, end-stage renal failure, diabetes, COPD, congestive heart failure, things of that nature. I also saw how some of the hospice patients that were moved to the COVID units that died of terminal illness were actually put on the COVID death list, which is complete fraud. And facilities were facilitating this and doing this the whole time. More people survived and had no issues and were asymptomatic that were well into their 80s and 90s than that passed away. My entire experience on these COVID units, I think there were 12 deaths, and none of those deaths could fully be attributed to COVID. It was all pre-existing conditions or terminal illness. Since the rollout of the vaccine at my facility, Moderna was the vaccine that they administered, I've seen 32 elderly people pass away immediately after taking the Moderna vaccine. None of that is being talked about on the news. None of that is being spoken about, on the media. It doesn't fit their narrative. I've seen more people pass away from the vaccine than I have on COVID units, which is really weird, seeing that supposedly we have really high COVID case numbers.
So how do we include those post-COVID people in the numbers of the patients we have in the hospital that are off the COVID floor, but still are occupying the hospital for a variety of reasons?
Okay. Carolyn, we call those, I'm sorry, we're calling those recovered now. If you look at the Novant Health dashboard, they're listed as recovered. But I do think from our standpoint, we would still consider them a COVID patient because they're still healing.
Yeah. So I think that needs to be highlighted as well.
Yeah.
Because once they're off isolation, they drop from the COVID numbers. That's exactly right.
Kellen, we can talk offline and how we run that up to marketing.
Right.
So it's just fraud on every level. Just higher reimbursement in medical facilities for someone that's labeled COVID. Whether you treat them for COVID or not, you're going to get higher reimbursement. I know this for a fact.
Here we are today with a pandemic that is causing mass hysteria. Like the days of people demonizing gay men as the culprits behind the epidemic, we have the media demonizing the unvaccinated as the root cause for why this virus just won't go away. Many hope the vaccine would stop the spread and eradicate the virus, but like AIDS, the virus seems to mutate too quickly. The same way Fauci discouraged and even prevented inexpensive treatments from being talked about, researched, and prescribed back then is the same thing that is happening today. In reality, our government officials should be working on absolutely everything from every angle to attack this virus, from vaccine developments and PPE gear to treatments, protocols, vitamins, health routines, and repurposing other drugs. They should be using our tax dollars to study inexpensive treatments that Big Pharma has zero interest in studying because they can't make billions off of them. And yes, Big Pharma should also continue to try and find a cure or a vaccine. Everything should be tried. Nothing should be spared. Nothing should be demonized. Everything should be studied. But just like what happened during the AIDS epidemic, that just doesn't seem to be happening.
I became the lead witness for the U.S. Senate testimony of November 19th, 2020. And the reason why there was Senate testimony is because there was a near total block on any information of treatment to patients. Patients actually think that the virus is untreatable. And so what happens is they go out to get a diagnosis. It says, here, you're COVID positive. Go home. Is there any treatment? No. Is there any resources I can call? No. Any referral lines, hotlines? No. Any research hotlines? No. There's such a focus on the vaccine. Where's the focus on people sick right now?
WHO, the NIH, the CDC was providing no guidance to clinicians on how to treat this disease. If you remember at the beginning, the WHO said the treatment was symptomatic care. So if you got COVID, you took Tylenol or aspirin. If you were in the ICU, you got fluid. To March and April, people were dying of COVID, and the WHO and the NIH said, there's no treatment, it's all symptomatic care. That's absurd. You can't just sit at the bedside, watch your patients die. So that's what really forced us to put together evidence-based protocols. So we first identified corticosteroids as important and vitamin C and D. And probably in about October, we recognized that there was emerging data on ivermectin. It wasn't there at the beginning, but there was emerging body of evidence. And I don't think many doctors understand the strength of the evidence. They're being influenced by the media, and the media is very powerful. The media is basically controlled by Big Pharma. And all you have to do is listen to the media, and all you hear about is ivermectin's a toxic drug for humans, it's only for horses.
Do I have to sue CNN?
I don't know, do you?
They're making shit up. They keep saying I'm taking horse dewormer. I literally got it from a doctor. It's an American company.
Mm-hmm.
They won the Nobel Prize in 2015 for use in human beings.
Yeah.
And CNN is saying I'm taking horse dewormer. The Tokyo Medical Association chairman held a live press conference recommending ivermectin to all doctors for all COVID patients. There's a lot of speculation. One of the speculations involves the emergency use authorization for the vaccines. That in order for there to be an emergency use authorization, there has to be no treatment for a disease.
Right.
So because there is this treatment in ivermectin, and there's other treatments too.
Right.
Because of this, there's a lot of pushback against potential treatments and pretending that they don't really work or that they're conspiracy theories. This is the grand conspiracy, right? The grand conspiracy is that the pharmaceutical companies are all in cahoots to try to make anybody who takes this stuff look crazy.
Under federal law, you cannot get a product like one of these vaccines, cannot get emergency use authorization if there is a previously approved product, and it could be approved for any use, that is found effective to treat the target disease. Oh, if anybody could make the point that hydroxychloroquine and ivermectin were indeed effective against COVID, it would be illegal for all of those vaccine companies to get an emergency use authorization, and the entire project would have collapsed. And that's why you saw this targeted propaganda campaign crusade.
Well, a new false cure for COVID in high demand. Ivermectin, a drug most commonly used to deworm large animals like horses, is selling out.
Embraced by many anti-vax groups too. Also, the use of ivermectin to treat COVID has found serious errors.
There is no ivermectin available in all of Saskatchewan. The government, Big Pharma, is blocking ivermectin.
Sure. Yep.
So that if you have good early treatment, there is no emergency. It takes out the wind from their sails. They cannot then push the vaccine. And the blocking of ivermectin is another potential crime against humanity.
There are 60 clinical trials that have looked at ivermectin, of which 30 are randomized controlled trials. Mm-hmm. And what the randomized trials show almost universally is decreased time to viral shedding, decreased hospitalization, decreased time to improvement, and decreased mortality.
I refused to let a patient languish at home with no treatment and then be hospitalized when it was too late. It was obvious. That was obvious in April that was the case. So I used the best tools or drugs available at the time, and these are appropriately off-label use of conventional medicine to treat an illness. So yes, we use drugs to affect viral replication. The antibodies are terrific. We can use intracellular anti-infectives in that box. The best anti-inflammatory drug is colchicine. Over 4,000 patients, double-blind randomized placebo-controlled trial. There's a 50% reduction in mortality. No word of it. None. So I have always treated my patients with something to treat the virus, something to treat the inflammation, and something to treat fibrosis. But I have to tell you, what has gone on has been beyond belief. What happened in around May, it became known that the virus was going to be amenable to a vaccine. All efforts on treatment were dropped. The National Institutes of Health actually had a multi-drug program. They dropped it after 20 patients, said we can't find the patients. The most disingenuous announcement of all time. And then Warp Speed went full tilt for vaccine development. And there was a silencing of any information on treatment. Any.
When I talked to my mom's doctor, who was a straight Fauci acolyte, and I said, my mother is 93 years old. I said, what if she gets sick? What are we going to do for early treatment? He said, there is no early treatment. She goes home. When she can't breathe, we'll send her up to Mass General Hospital and get her intubated and give her remdesivir. Both things which will kill you. That is the protocol today, and that was the protocol from the beginning.
Anthony Fauci was declaring that there's this new drug that is mandated in all hospitals and used by all medical doctors in America called remdesivir, and it is the only treatment to be used in all hospitals. I went to the FDA's website to find out any information about remdesivir, only to find out remdesivir was never FDA approved to be safe or efficacious for any disease. On the NIH's website, Anthony Fauci said, we're going to use this non-FDA approved drug because of this research study on Ebola.
This is the study. Ebola virus inside of Africa. They took 4 regions, gave them all remdesivir and 3 other experimental drugs. Anthony Fauci said it was proven to be safe and effective against the Ebola virus. So what did the actual study find? You see mortality up there? They pulled remdesivir, they pulled ZMapp, which was supplied by our government to Africa because it killed more people. How many people did it kill? Remdesivir killed 54% of all people in the study that got the drug. Look up here. I'm not lying. This is from the study. Look at the second column from the right, remdesivir. Look below there. 54%. He then quoted a second study in May 2020, Anthony Fauci did, that supported the use of remdesivir in the treatment of coronavirus. This was actually done by Gilead Sciences, who makes remdesivir. In early March 2020, they took 53 patients from Japan, Canada, and America who had COVID-19, and they put them on the drug for 10 days. 23% in 10 days had serious adverse events. The most common serious adverse events were multiple organ dysfunction syndrome, which is defined as the #1 cause of death in all ICUs, by the way.
Acute kidney failure, septic shock, and hypotension. 8% of them had to be taken off the drug on day 5 or 10 because they were dying from the poison of the drug's effects on multiple organs. It was never proven safe. It was never proven effective. And then I learned America was the only country from January 2020 until October 2020 to treat all COVID patients with remdesivir. Our country bought up all of remdesivir reserves. We're the only country that used it for the whole first 10 months of 2020. And which country in the world had the most deaths in the entire world? The United States of America. Do you want to know why? They poisoned them all to death with remdesivir. So did Anthony Fauci know about remdesivir's death? Oh, you better believe it.
For each vaccine, they're supposed to list the health benefits and the risks associated with those vaccines. The FDA created these fact sheets. Do you know not one of these showed up on that list or on that fact sheet?
How many people get sick if they're vaccinated versus how many people get sick if they weren't vaccinated? So that's its vaccine efficacy number. But if you ask the question, why are people getting vaccinated? That's not why they're getting vaccinated. They're getting vaccinated so they don't get sick. And that's called an absolute risk reduction. And if you go to the EUA documents for Pfizer, Moderna, Janssen, the 3 that are EUA approved in the US, and you ask that fundamental question, how many people do not get sick? For Pfizer, that using their data, there's no statistically significant reduction in COVID cases for vaccinated people versus unvaccinated. If you look at Moderna, the same thing. No statistical reduction in COVID cases for the vaccinated versus the unvaccinated. Janssen did a little bit more complex. They looked at results at 2 weeks. At 2 weeks after the injection, there is a statistical reduction in the number of COVID cases. If you carry that out 2 more weeks, which they did, that difference is gone. There's no, so if you want to vaccinate people, I guess every 2 weeks, go for it.
It's the job of the pharmaceutical company interacting with the FDA to prove that this kind of a modification is safe and to prove that everything in the system behaves the way it's supposed to behave, the way that you claim that it's behaved. So the FDA is really typically pretty persnickety. If you say that the spike is going to stay put, they want you to show that it stays put.
Most people are under the impression that you get an injection in your muscle, that it stays in your muscle, except that's not what happens. The studies were very clear. The lipid nanoparticle influenza vaccine made by Moderna spread to the brain, the bone marrow, the liver, the spleen, the heart, kidneys, the intestine, every part of the animal's body. It doesn't stay at the site of injection.
It was a bit alarming to some of us when this study came out from Harvard and Brigham's of nurses that had received Moderna vaccine that showed with a very sensitive assay that they had free spikes circulating in their blood, because that wasn't supposed to happen according to what was published before. That free spike is circulating for like 14 to almost up to a month at detectable levels. And again, that should have been known before it ever went into humans based on animal model studies. It's not that hard to figure out. But for some reason it wasn't.
Those spike proteins do circulate in the body, and the biodistribution studies do show that they accumulate in the liver and strongly in the ovary in certain studies. And we don't know the long-term meaning other than I'm finding some of those proteins in some of these tissues. And once we have enough data points and enough autopsies, we will print our data and show here's the inflammation from the spike protein landing in the heart and or in the immune cells that are landing in the heart, triggering even more and more inflammation. Once a heart cell is damaged, it's damaged forever. It doesn't replace itself with another heart cell, it replaces itself with a scar. So you tell me you want to give a 12-year-old, a 5-year-old, a 13-year-old, an 18-year-old a shot, and we see about a 200 times increase in myocarditis in our society right now. That's a good idea. Let's give a kid a toxin, ruin his heart for life. Stop and think about what we're doing.
I was a father of a 16-year-old son, a single parent. I raised my boy since he was a baby. He meant the world to me. We got the Pfizer vaccine because I thought it was to protect him. I thought it was the right thing to do. They're trying to target the 5 to 12-year-olds, and they say it's worth the risk. It wasn't worth the risk to me. Like I said, I've always said I love the hell out of my country, but I don't trust my government anymore. I'm here because I'm Junior's voice. I'm doing this in my son's honor. If I can protect 1 or 2 children, that means the world to me. They knew what was happening. I consider that murder. Because in December 17th, 2020, they did a study, and they knew they caused heart conditions in teenagers. Why wasn't this information released until October 1st this year? If we would have known this, my son would be here with me.
When you have people at an FDA meeting making a statement that we need to vaccinate the children, but we won't know what happens to them until we vaccinate them, that's the experimental phase of a research project. And as of 1947, I thought that we had officially, although it's very clear from the Tuskegee Airmen and other studies that have been done, paid for by the US government, that it seems that our leaders don't have a problem experimenting on our elderly, on our police officers, on our first responders, on our doctors and nurses, on our general public, and now apparently don't have a problem experimenting on our children.
There is no rationale for vaccinating the children, none, with the exception of those that have significant pre-existing disease. There's about 400 children that have died with COVID. That doesn't mean they died of COVID.
Every single one of those had major pre-existing medical conditions. For healthy, normal children that aren't morbidly obese and don't have cystic fibrosis or some other major pre-existing condition, their chance of getting hospitalized or dying from this is 0, but their chance of having damage to their heart is about 6 times their risk from the virus itself. It's still small, but it happens. The damage that's caused to the heart doesn't go away. It doesn't heal. It scars.
The FDA and the CDC reviewed cases in June. They had 200 cases of younger individuals, and they showed that 90% were hospitalized. It looked serious. We now have raced up to 5,000 cases of myocarditis in the United States.
We are seeing more damage in the youth from the shot than we are from the virus. And it's, again, it's kind of apples to oranges, because it's that lack of will to say, okay, somebody's sick, let's early treat them. They'll say, oh, but COVID can cause myocarditis too. Yes, it can. But guess what? If you early treat it and clear that virus quickly, then no, it doesn't. And so that lack of will to treat early is a will to cause damage. It's malfeasance not to treat early.
We basically got it. We have fulfilled Hill's tenets of causality. The vaccine is causing these events. The FDA says, warning, this causes myocarditis, don't do it. The FDA has told us this. The CDC agrees with all the data. That doesn't equal mandatory vaccination for children. It mandates just the opposite.
what we're seeing with vaccinated individuals are healthy people reacting. Why? Because they're not getting exposed to 1,000 or 10,000 virus particles from somebody else who coughed or sneezed on them. They're getting billions. And if they have a functioning, healthy body, their immune system is looking at that and saying, wow, we have just been massively infected, and they mount an immune response. And that immune response has inflammation and blood clotting. You release chemicals to kill the cells that are infected. That's why you get a runny nose. That's that fluid being released. And blood clotting to wall off the invader so that it can't get out, number one, and number two, can't get nutrients in, so it dies. And what we're seeing with all the people with adverse events are all the people that are healthy, younger, responding to what appears to be an overwhelming infection in their body with all the spike proteins, and we're seeing inflammation and blood clotting. And you've seen it with strokes and seizures and heart disease and, miscarriages and deaths that we've never seen before in the history of mankind for vaccines that have been made.
Testes, kind of important for the next generation, right? As much as that looks like a lovely heart, see all the blue in it? Inflammation. Same thing in the ovaries. Here's the problem. Essentially absent from the literature. What are they hiding from us? Japanese biodistribution study took some doing to find this study. Dr. Bridle up in Canada, and of course he was attacked for telling the truth. The lipid nanoparticle that surrounds the little mRNA they're injecting into people's bodies, yes, a lot of it stays in the deltoid, but it circulates as well. Guess where it likes to concentrate? A really biologically active organ, the ovary. In the Pfizer paperwork and application, it clearly states that in the rats there was a 16% decrease in fertility. One of the most fertile little critters, mammals on the planet. And these are not the droids you're looking for, never mind. So what's it doing to humanity? Guess what? The answer is, we don't know.
And there is a peer-reviewed paper that has recently been published by a group in Sweden. So now we have a confirmation in this paper, and it's a serious paper. They did really good controls, and they did 5-time duplicate assays, that there is reverse transcription going on from RNA to DNA. Now, in this particular work, they didn't confirm whether or not integration occurs, but I guarantee that that paper is coming because they have confirmed that SARS can reverse transcribe and integrate into the human genome. So there's no reason not to believe that a component of SARS would not do the same. And perhaps even more disturbing was that the reverse transcriptase that they tested to determine whether or not it was the reverse transcriptase which was inducing the reverse transcription of the RNA was something called line 1. It's a retrotransposon that is implicated in embryogenesis. And if during the embryogenetic process, line 1 is altered in specific ways, then embryogenesis can get very messed up. It can terminate. This could be implicated in destroying fetuses and the embryos. We are seeing off the charts miscarriages and spontaneous abortions and disruptions of women's menstrual cycles. Why?
The research done by independent researchers have shown that there is damage to the brains and other body organs caused by these viruses and these vaccines that are called prion diseases. So you can have mad cow disease in the brain, or Alzheimer's in the brain, or amyloid disease in the heart, which is another type of prion disease. But the studies done by people doing the research on the animals have been very clear and very consistent. Prion diseases, inflammation and blood clotting or inflammothrombotic diseases, and real concerns about miscarriages and other health problems and deaths. None of this has been done by Pfizer, Moderna, Janssen, or the other companies.
But if there are fertility issues as a consequence of this, it could be the most grotesque mistake ever made in medical history.
On the cancer front, we already know that there are doctors talking about the fact that they are seeing their patients coming out of remission after years, in very close temporal proximity to getting these injections. Is it because the immune system has been disrupted for some reason because of these injections? The guys keeping the cancer at bay are just not able to do that anymore, like CD8 positive T cells, for example. Is something happening to our genomes that's causing this disruption? We have so many fundamental questions in biology right now that need to be answered. And this isn't in a petri dish. These products are in 5 billion human beings now.
The fact that the spike protein is a gain-of-function developed virus, which by definition is a bioweapon, replicating that same genetic sequence and putting it into a vaccine, it doesn't matter how you get it into the human body, it's still a bioweapon. This animal research should have been done. It violates every treaty and code that we've ever had as human beings. There was one instance in time that animal research was abandoned by doing it on people first. And we prosecuted those people in 1947 at the Nuremberg trials.
If they are saying that this is an emergency of such grotesque proportion that it warrants the introduction of a warp speed vaccine that's not been tested anywhere close to what it should have been, then here's another exposure that they have. If you're going to do that with such potential for horrible things happening, then you are obligated as government to put in place right from the very get-go a very efficient monitoring system for what is going wrong. And that was not done.
As a physician, I've tried to call in to the VAERS reporting system, and I get a recording that gives me another telephone number to go to. When I call that number, it gives me a recording and no place to leave a message. I have colleagues who have tried to enter it in on the computer system, and it keeps bouncing back. Now, if you come into a hospital or doctor's office and you have an adverse event to measles, mumps, and rubella vaccines, there's a code to enter into that, and it goes into the computer. If you have an adverse event to diphtheria and tetanus vaccine, there's a code for that that goes into the computer, and that will be tracked through history. These things are called computerized procedural terminology, CPT codes. There is no CPT code to enter into a computer system for an adverse event to any of these SARS-CoV-2 vaccines.
Safety and efficacy are the two cornerstones of measurement in terms of whether vaccines or injections should be maintained in a rollout into the human population. And I think that these particular products, these COVID-19 products, they fail on both counts. I think that's pretty much been shown in the data. Based on the vaccine adverse event reporting system data of the United States, and also based on the phase 3 clinical trial data and subsequent trial data sets, the total number of adverse event reports filed to VAERS for this year, and we've basically completed 1 year of the injection rollouts, is 1,700% higher than the average of the past 10 to 30 years. You'll get approximately somewhere between 35,000 and 39,000 adverse event reports. And what we're at now, and this is only for the domestic data, is 705,991. The range of the types of adverse event reports is staggering. And on the subject of death, because this is probably the most severe adverse event report that you can file, we're thousands of % of an increase in reporting over the past 30 years. Even if we do not apply an underreporting factor, the number of deaths in VAERS right now, including the foreign data set, is over 28,000. This far exceeds 53 people. This is just the United States. If you multiply that by even a fraction of the underreporting factor that I calculated, like 5 or 6, you still get an exceedingly large number of people who have died in the context of a product that A, they probably didn't need because they had immunity, or B, that they took on good faith because they were told that they needed to protect their community and that this was going to save them. Pharmaceutical companies are notorious for having a bad track record? All these very important questions that every single human being needs to know the answer to right now are not being answered. If they can expedite the biological products such that they reach 5 billion arms, then they can expedite the answers to our questions.
When it comes to free speech, most people figure it's your right to say white if I say black. In terms of doing science, it's absolutely something you should think about doing. But at the moment, the government and Pfizer are forcing us to not recognize that black is black. And when it comes to this, we're in a situation that is more than defending free speech. We have to stand up against tyranny.
The world, the way that I believe things work, that there were rules, that we all obey these rules, that these rules were designed to keep us safe and protect us and to ensure that there was equity and proper way of doing things. I realized that that was just grossly naive. I don't know what the rules are anymore. There don't seem to be any rules. It's whatever those in power say is what goes.
It's not science, it's business. And that's the problem we have, because you cannot get to see the data. What Pfizer are offering you is not scientific information, it's promotional material. They're not in the business of looking after your safety, they're in the business of selling treatments and making money. They're not attempting to help us live the lives that we want to live. They're in the business of forcing us to live the life that Pfizer want us to live.
And when the FDA is being paid in order to fast track all of these drugs and asking a court to block the release of the Pfizer COVID injection trial documentation for 75 years, it's pretty clear they're not working in the interests of the public. They're working in the interests of the industry, and there's a problem. So, I mean, science is broken.
So we are now expected to take someone like Fauci as a scientific authority when the most qualified people scientifically to tell you about what's going on here are deactivated, are thrown off even Twitter, Facebook, anywhere that they might try to inform the public. They are being shut down, and clinics that cure patients are being shut down in the name of profits for the corporatocracy.
Clinicians and professional societies need to declare up front that they will not endorse treatments or vaccines unless there is complete data transparency. Without data, it's not science.
Data sharing. We know NIH did a study. I'd love to know what was in it. It's unethical to hide research if there's information in there to help people. I know this. I'm a researcher.
The vaccine manufacturers had actually gotten fake studies published in journals like the New England Journal of Medicine and Lancet, the leading scientific journals of the world, published several articles about false studies that was then outed because there was a huge outcry in the scientific community, and they had to retract this. They had to apologize. People are coming from high levels of this corporatocracy when they discover this kind of thing and realize that it's more and more difficult to uncover the truth.
Scientists are not supposed to believe anything. Scientists are supposed to have some evidence that leads them tentatively to some conclusion or to some action. They're supposed to be able to show that to other scientists, any interested person, in fact, who's willing to understand what it is that was used as evidence, should be able to say, yeah, I agree with that. That makes sense, using rules of inference that we've used since Aristotle.
What I see as most important is to say no to the money. Everybody should say no to industry money. Doctors, nurses, the Food and Drug Administration, hospitals, chairs of department, everyone should say no to drug company money and other drug company favors. Something is badly wrong in the United States. And I believe that what is wrong is the belief in the United States in unrestrained capitalism and market forces that will solve all problems, which is definitely wrong. Market forces in healthcare will create problems, and capitalism is a very bad motivator for achieving good results in healthcare. it is counterproductive.
The WHO is on track to get nearly all Western countries to sign on to this agreement on pandemic preparedness that would grant the WHO absolute power over global biosecurity, such as the power to implement digital identities, vaccine passports, mandatory vaccinations, travel restrictions globally, standardized medical care, and so much more. This treaty includes 190 countries and would be legally binding. If a pandemic is declared, the WHO takes over the global health management of the pandemic. What's more here, the WHO would be in full control over what gets called a pandemic. They could dictate how doctors can respond, which drugs can and cannot be used, or which vaccines are approved. And this is for the entire globe, not just one country. And it gets better, because at the same moment that this treaty is being drafted, guess who's back? Bill Gates has announced the creation of a pandemic germ team that will monitor sovereign nations and decide when they need to suspend civil liberties, force people to wear masks, and to close borders. According to Gates, the global team will be made up of some 3,000 disease experts under WHO purview and will receive around $1 billion per year in funding.
Well, what's happened now is that capital is no longer constrained by nation state. These blocks of money are independent of countries. They're more powerful than countries. They tell the U.S. Treasury what to do. They tell the U.S. Federal Reserve what to do. It's not the other way around anymore. It is a cost-benefit analysis in the pharmaceutical industry about misbehavior. They are not grounded in the ethical principles that you and I, as average people, believe in. They are about profit, return on investment. And furthermore, the overlords that own them, BlackRock, Vanguard, State Street, etc., these large, massive funds that are completely decoupled from nation states, have no moral core. They have no moral purpose. Their only purpose is return on investment. And that is the core problem here. You've got these four major investment firms that all own each other. And all of these companies that are giving this messaging all over the world, the media companies, the IT companies, the pharmaceutical companies, all of this matrix that's now horizontally integrated is really all divisions of one company. What we're seeing is the consequences of consolidation of finances, of money and power globally. The sequence data indicate that this was an engineered virus. Was it engineered through natural selection and passaging in animals and animal models that were engineered, or was it engineered through molecular mechanisms like CRISPR-Cas9 system? But it was engineered. The documents are pretty clearly showing that gain of function research in that Wuhan lab was funded by the NIH and was funded by DTRA, Defense Threat Reduction Agency.
The Biological Weapons Convention Treaty is very specific. It states that any bacterial agent, in this case a virus, that does not have a benefit for humanity is a violation of the Biological Weapons Convention Treaty. And it's important to note that this is a treaty that the United States has signed and ratified. Article 6 of the U.S. Constitution states that treaties are the supreme law of the land. The signing and ratification of the Biological Weapons Convention Treaty, the signing and ratification of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, the United States participating in the Nuremberg trials of 1947 to establish the Nuremberg Code and how patients should be treated, the Declaration of Helsinki that the U.S. has committed to for research patients, the American Medical Association Code of Ethics on Informed Consent, and anybody who has taken an oath of office, who has stood there and sworn to uphold and defend the Constitution of the United States, who then ignores these treaties, funds violation of these treaties, who refuses to allow patients to have informed consent, the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. If you've done that, you have violated the U.S. Constitution. And if you've taken an oath to uphold and defend the Constitution, then you have committed treason.
The RNA tech makes it possible to make customized vaccines fast, based on genetic information. you want to come up with a new weaponized incapacitating agent, then it's really easy to make a new vaccine to protect the people that are going to deploy that strategically into fill-in-the-blank area. It's possible, theoretically, to engineer pathogens that will selectively target different ethnic groups. That's the new reality, and we kind of got to all get attuned to that's what we're dealing with.
It is basically biological chip that it is in the tablet, and once you take the tablet and dissolves into your stomach, sends a signal that you took the tablet. So imagine the applications of that, compliance. The insurance companies to know that the medicines that patients should take, they do take them.
These vaccines have done nothing to solve the problem. They need to be stopped. The companies need to be held legally accountable. The questions about why all these codes and treaties that we claim that we honor are being abused needs to be addressed. The gain-of-function research needs to be stopped, at least until it can be done at some point under some type of control where it actually provides a benefit for humanity without a harm. 2 decades worth of gain-of-function research, all focused on increasing the infectivity of this virus, with consequences that are very clear around the world. There comes a time for everybody to be held accountable for things that they do, holding accountable the people that caused this chaos, this mayhem to begin with, and stopping it from occurring again.
Biologic agents, drones, and other things, and media manipulation, propaganda control, censorship is all integrated to enable global power. Access to these technologies of rapid response vaccine development is being leveraged for geopolitical benefit. It is a new vehicle for exerting global economic and political power. This is the reality that's behind all this. And we need to wake up.